Science, the supernatural, biblical prophecy, global events that threaten to rattle the very foundation of human existence. Critical examinations of the most important issues facing today's modern world. Welcome to the Sharpening Report. And now, your host, Josh Peck.
Hello and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Josh Peck. Tonight we have a returning guest, Doug Woodward, probably the guest that's been on more than any other on this show since the beginning. He's author of such books as Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, Power Quest 1 and 2, Final Babylon, as well as many others. It would take the entire show to list them all out if I were to try. But today we're talking about his new book, The Next Great War in the Middle East. Very, very exciting topic. So I want to get right into this. Without further ado, I'd love to welcome to the show Doug Woodward. Doug, how are you doing?
Hey, Josh, I'm doing well. I'm enjoying the early spring here in Oklahoma, except for the pollen that's causing me to sound a little congested. And but we Okies, we talk a little bit like we got something in our nose all the time anyway. So it's it's all right. So, but otherwise, I'm doing great. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're dealing with a little of that in Missouri now. Now we're basically neighbors now.
We are. We only live about a little more than 200 miles apart. Not too far.
Yeah, not too bad. Yeah, it's exciting stuff. We'll have to get together sometime. But yeah, we're dealing with a little bit of the allergies and some kind of flu or something that's been going on. But I think we're at the tail end of it, so that's exciting.
Well, as soon as you get over that, we could meet halfway in Tulsa.
Hey, there you go. That sounds great.
And have lunch or something, because it's a short drive for both of us.
Great. Yeah, we'll have to do that. That sounds good.
Yeah.
Well, this book is phenomenal, and I know, like, when it comes to prophecy, there's a lot of different interpretations on different things. And, sometimes it can be kind of challenging being in prophetic ministry because it's just going to happen. Sometimes people are going to disagree with people, but it's all about how we handle it. So where do you see some of these opinions diverge in your own research, and how do you combat against those?
Yeah, well, of course that's a broad question. The reality is that there are sort of major different prophetic schools of thought. Those of us that are kind of in a community where we spend a lot of time on prophecy, we tend to be futurist. Of course, by futurist, that basically means that we believe that there are a lot of prophecies in the Bible that have not been fulfilled, will be fulfilled in the future. And then the other sort of school of thought is preterism, which if our listeners have ever had Spanish, they know about the preterite tense, which is a past tense. And so preterism basically says, well, it's basically everything's already been fulfilled. And so Matthew 24 has been fulfilled. The book of Revelation really pertain just to the first and second century. It doesn't really pertain to the future. And it tends to go along with amillennialism, which means there really isn't a millennium. There is a coming kingdom, but it's basically when heaven comes to earth and so forth. And so, there's sort of the two broadest schools are preterism and futurism. And preterist, because it tends to be past tense, they tend not to talk about prophecy too much because there's no real reason to. Prophecy, has been fulfilled, and there's an apologetic reason why, apologetics being the defense of the faith. There's a reason why we look at Bible prophecy to help sort of validate that the Bible was true. But other than that, they don't seem to hold a lot of interest in it. And so, but yet we do. Those of us that follow Bible prophecy and we really believe that future events are still going to occur, we pay really careful attention. So it's really within the futurist school of thinking, if you will, where all the changes occur. Preterism, it's all sort of settled and done. And so in the futurist school, there have been a lot of changes over the last, I'd say 15 years especially. Maybe really 20, 25 years, the advent of the pre-wrath concept.
Right.
It used to be we just had pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib. but probably the most chic point of view regarding the rapture is the pre-wrath view, which is a bit of a compromise between pre-trib and post-trib, not quite mid-trib. Pre-wraths get a chance to sort of say, well, it happens sometime later in the tribulation, but not right up front, not right at the end, but it's not necessarily right in the middle either. So anyway, so that's been a major point of view. I'd say I talk about this kind of at the beginning of the book, is just sort of go through some of the major changes in prophecy. Certainly, sort of an alternative view regarding Catholicism. Some have always said historically, that, well, the Catholics, and the Pope, he's the Antichrist and all that. That's no longer really at the top of the list of issues. The bigger issue as it relates to Catholicism is the move of Pope Francis to create a unification of all the churches once again. And so that's been a major issue that comes up in the last 2 or 3 years. There's two major things, though, to kind of get more zeroed in on my book, The Next Great War in the Middle East. And they kind of both relate to wars. And the kind of the traditional view right now, the conventional view is that there are two major wars. There was a war of Gog and Magog, and then later on there was a war of Armageddon, and the two were separated by some number of years. But what's happened really, I don't know, it's maybe been in the last 10 years. The Bill Salas, when he wrote Israelistine, then later Psalm 83, he convinced a very large, I would say, majority of futurists that there is a third war that begins prior to the war of Gog and Magog. And Salas argues that war is Psalm 83, and he argues that it is a future war, even though it was written by Asaph, who was the psalmist for King David, and would make it almost 3,000 years old, if not exactly 3,000 years old. That Psalm 83 will occur, and Psalm 83 will be a war in which the nation of Israel utterly defeats all of its immediate surrounding neighbors, whether we're dealing with Hezbollah in Lebanon, or we're dealing with Hamas in Palestine and Gaza, the Palestinians, I should say. That Israel will defeat all those neighbors and become a great empire. That is Bill Salas's theory of Psalm 83. We'll talk about that and why I think it's not quite right. But anyway, that created a third war. And then on the other side of things, a new thing. New, I speaking relatively, it's been about really since about 2007, 2008, so it's almost 8 years old, is the notion of the Islamic Antichrist. And the Islamic Antichrist, which was really put forth, promoted by Joel Richardson, not Joel Rosenberg, but Joel Richardson and Walid Shubat. Those two gentlemen, and then really kind of a slew of others that have kind of fallen in line with that. They have argued that the Antichrist will be Islamic. He will be from an Islamic country. They usually argue Turkey, and that the war of Gog and Magog is the same war as Armageddon. It happens at the end of the tribulation, which means they're generally post-trib believers, and there is no Psalm 83 war. That the Psalm 83 war is confusing various elements of when Messiah returns and when Messiah defeats the enemies of Israel, and there's some truth, I believe, in their assessment of the Psalm 83 thing. So you've essentially got three different views. You've got, it depends upon how many wars. You've got the new Islamic Antichrist position that says there's really one major war. You've got the conventional theory, that really conventional in terms of Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye, the late great and Jeffrey, and so forth, that said that there were two wars, Gog and Magog and the Battle of Armageddon. And then you've got Bill Salas that says there's really a third war, and that's Psalm 83. And so in Psalm 83, the burden of Damascus, Isaiah 17 is kind of roped into that. And Bill also has a newer book called The Prophecy of Elam, which talks about a potential nuclear accident or nuclear bombing in the eastern Iran, and that could be part of his Psalm 83 scenarios. So now you can kind of see why it is I entitled the book "The Next Great War in the Middle East," and because it does tend to indicate where you stand in terms of futurism.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So your book basically deals with those two main points about Psalm 83 and then about who the Antichrist might be.
Right.
So first, Psalm 83, is this the next war, or is this something totally different?
Well, Bill Sellis, who is a good brother and a good thinker, and has really done a lot for the kingdom. He's done some great work, and his perspective is the Psalm 83 is known as an imprecatory psalm. The imprecation, really, if you actually study what it means a curse, and it literally is the psalmist asking God to curse the enemies of Israel. And it is a psalm that talks in terms of all of the enemies coming against Israel, that they plot against Israel, and it goes through and it names all these different tribes. And the tribes were clearly present at the time of King David and Asaph 3,000 years ago, but it does go around kind of around the horn, if you will, all around Israel and naming these different tribes. It never really intimates time. So time is never really an element in the psalm. So the psalm could literally have a double fulfillment, or it could have no fulfillment. The first question you ask is Psalm 83 really a prophecy, or is it just a lament? Some incorrectly say that Psalm 83 prophecy is a lament. It is a lament or a lamentation, but it is actually an imprecation. So it's pleading with God to curse the enemies of God, and it essentially is the situation. I hesitate to call it a war because actually I think it is. I do think it's prophetic, because I'll get to that in a moment. But the psalmist ask for God to destroy the enemies that are trying to destroy and wipe out the name of Israel. And so it looks like that the enemies of Israel, they have one motive, and that motive is to destroy Israel and to remove it utterly from the earth. And the Psalm 83 concludes with a statement regarding the name of God. What is the name of God? Who is the name of God? And so it does seem to suggest that the enemies of Israel call God by a different name. And of course, the Psalm 83 theory as well, we're dealing with Islam, and we're dealing with Allah. And so the prophecy is saying that at the end of time, end of days, that the enemies of Israel will all call God by a different name, and we're asking for the Lord God, Yahweh or Jehovah, to establish the fact that it is his name that is the only name and the only God. And so that's sort of the background, if you will, to the Psalm 83 idea. Now the question is when and if Psalm 83 really occurred. And we know it was written 3,000 years ago. Bill believes it's really not as much a reference to the wars that have occurred in the 20th and 21st century as much as it is a reference to a future war that will occur and will be sort of utterly decisive, meaning that there will be this inner ring of nations, which we would include Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and who am I leaving out? Probably Iraq, portions of Iraq. So if you draw this sort of what's called the inner circle, and you sort of pick out those nations, it excludes other nations that are typically mentioned in Ezekiel 38, for instance, which we'll get to. So the idea is that all of these nations are decimated by Israel, and that Israel takes over all their land and becomes a very much enriched nation. And it's because of that then it leads to the view that, well, there's a discussion in Ezekiel 38 that says that Gog will come against Israel to, it's implied to take booty. You have to get into the scripture specifically to see why it is I believe that that particular passage, Ezekiel 10 through 13, or Ezekiel 38, 10 through 13, I believe is referencing the United States, not Israel, which of course is very controversial, and it's got Bill Salas all in an uproar. Rightly so, because I'm taking a real shot at the core of his thesis that has become essentially a standard view, and I'm challenging orthodoxy here. I'm saying, nope, Bill, I think you're wrong. I think Psalm 83 is a prophecy. The fact that Israel will always be, until Messiah comes, will always be at war with its neighbors. They will always hate Israel. We certainly see that today. I do not believe that it implies, because Psalm 83 doesn't. Psalm 83 just says, God, please, destroy all our enemies. Bill is, in fact, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story, but Bill is, in fact, pulling some information out of Ezekiel 38, verses 10 through 13. And from that, he is drawing the conclusion that Psalm 83 is an event that causes Gog to become jealous and envious and greedy and want to attack Israel. And I'll basically point out that that's actually just a logical conclusion, and actually a wrong conclusion that I believe Bill's drawn.
Sure, well, that makes sense. And just so, because there might be people that are coming into this fresh and don't know who Bill Salas is, or this might be the first time that they came across your research. So just for the audience, you and Bill aren't like actually fighting about this or anything like.
No, we're having a friendly, we're having a hotly contested ping pong match.
Exactly, it's all done in love and respect, and
because he and I agree on virtually everything, but he does not agree with me in terms of the specificity I suggest regarding the United States and Bible prophecy, and I've challenged his baby essentially by saying, well, I do think, Bill, you're right. Psalm 83 has a prophetic implication, but I don't believe it's a future war. I believe that it is a fulfillment. It is a prophecy that has been fulfilled in 1948, the War of Independence in 1967, the Six-Day War, 1973, Yom Kippur War, the Intifada's that occurred in Lebanon and so forth. And we're kind of going through one of those now, in terms of all the knifings in Jerusalem. But I am saying I do not believe there will be a specific war. Obviously we see Israel like going into Gaza and destroying tunnels and cleaning out some of the people that are firing missiles, and they did the same thing with Hezbollah in Lebanon and back in the late 90s. Those are the ways. That's the way that Israel has to deal with it. They have to deal with it with a rifle, not with a shotgun. And yet, Josh, what is concerning to me about this is the theory that Psalm 83 conveys to people is that Israel will be militaristic and it will go against sort of the will of all of the world, and it will intentionally kill literally millions of Palestinians, Jordanians, Lebanese, Iraqis, and so forth by conquering the lands immediately surrounding it. It will acquire their possessions, their booty, if you will. And I just believe that that's a misinterpretation of the Ezekiel 38 prophecy and incorrectly linking the two. And B, I think it's geopolitically nonsense. I do not see a precedent for Israel being able to do that. I mean, they do the 6-Day War and immediately they give the Temple Mount back before they've even basically unloaded their equipment, and they do this 73 Yom Kippur War, and after some negotiation, they give back almost all of the Sinai. So, Israel has never shown a propensity to conquer and take more land and then keep more land, other than arguably the West Bank and the Golan Heights. and those are for some pretty strong security reasons. But a lot of the debate about the two-state solution, about going back to the 1967 borders, and all these kinds of things, deal with Israel being too greedy, taking too much land, and of course that's the reality that Israel faces. Israel is always under the gun, sort of metaphorically speaking, and they can't take a really strong reactionary move without the whole world coming against them. And literally, I would say, yes, if Israel did destroy its surrounding neighbors and then take all of their material goods as well as their oil and so forth, yes, that would precipitate a war of Gog and Magog, but it's for very different reasons. And I don't believe that is, when one looks at it from a geopolitical and historical standpoint, I don't believe that that is a viable argument. But, Josh, it has become virtually standard. David Reagan subscribes to it. Even Hal Lindsey has modified his view, subscribing to it. The only other persons that actually oppose that point of view right now, ironically, are those that subscribe to the Islamic Antichrist.
And that brings up a good topic too, and actually is my next question. And it's kind of funny, like talking about prophecy. I think what most people hate about prophecy is actually the thing that I like about it. There are all these different interpretations and different views. To me, it's kind of like reading a good mystery book and then finding out what happens in the end. To me, life is kind of like that when it deals with prophecy. I like it. Now, of course, I don't like all when there are other ministries that fight, and I can't stand that. But when you have somebody like yourself who knows how to talk about these things and disagree with another brother in Christ, but without throwing them under the bus and attacking them personally.
That's right. Yeah.
That's what I like, because then to me it's like, well, then I can just get the unfiltered information and then try to figure out what's really going on here. And I love that. But you bring up the Antichrist. Now, why do some focus on Islam and Turkey in terms of the Antichrist? Where's that whole thing start from?
Yeah. Well, I would argue that its ultimate origin is whoever the enemy of the United States is at that time, they become the bad guy.
That makes sense.
So back in the 1930s, Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, became viewed as, well, he's a Roman, he's in Italy, so clearly he's going to be the Antichrist. And then later we go, well, no, he's not as strong as Hitler, so Hitler's the Antichrist. And then, then we sort of shifted into the whole Soviet Union thing after World War II. And we deal with the different Soviet leaders, and then Gorbachev pops up, and he's got this sort of giant birthmark sitting on his forehead, and people start going, "Oh, is that the mark of the beast?" And of course, that's just like, oh my goodness, the mark of the beast as a birthmark because it's on his forehead. No, I don't think so. So, but that was kind of the sloppy hermeneutic that method of interpretation that a lot of people sort of had. But I think that there's some truth to that it's kind of, we're all very fearful of Islam. Those of us that are sort of the wide Anglo-Saxon Protestants, in North America, to some extent perhaps the Catholics too, but we're fearful of this just irrational, jihadist, crazy mentality that it's like the Queen of Hearts and Alice in Wonderland, off with their heads. So they have been using deadly force in very random ways, and of course this led to just a massive amount of problems in the Middle East. And by the way, in the new book, the first 100 pages of the book really deal with the whole Middle East situation. Why has it become so entangled, and how has the U.S. failed, and what in U.S. policy has led to that, and then why does that lead to really the conflict of Russia and the U.S., which I think is part and parcel of Gog and Magog. But getting back to your question, why an Islamic Antichrist? There's no question that there's a good argument. Joel Richardson, I just recently had an opportunity to debate Joel very politely and in Christian love on Southwest Radio Church. Joel and I were hosted by Larry Spargimino, And we did three 24-minute shows, something like that, and they'll be airing here definitely this month. I don't know if they're going to start like this next week or the week after, but then they'll probably be combined to a single 60-minute video or something like that. So we get into it pretty good, and we both score good points, I think. So I don't know that either one really won the debate, because you can't really go through the whole issue in that short of a period of time, but we certainly give everybody an introduction to it. But anyway, Joel looks at the scriptures, and he believes that that there's a whole slew of issues that lead us to conclude that that the mortal head wound that is healed is not the Roman Empire. It's not a revived Roman Empire, but it is the Ottoman Empire that really existed basically from the 10th or 11th century all the way into the 20th century, and it really came to a close in 1924. In 1917, Jerusalem was sort of conquered by Major or General Allenby for the English, and that was a major thing, because Jerusalem had been under control for 400 years, 1517 to 1917, which in fact was a prophecy from a Jewish rabbi back in the 11th or 12th century that predicted exactly that the Turks would control Jerusalem for 4 centuries.
Wow.
Exactly. And so I can't remember. It's not Akiva. I don't remember that rabbi's name, but it is well known and well documented that he made that prediction. So anyway, the Ottoman Empire concluded in 1924. Turkey became very secular, and it sort of began to emulate the West. And so the Turkish Empire, was coming to a close. The movie Lawrence of Arabia talks a bit about this whole issue of the Arabs that united under Lawrence, the English, and kind of defeated the Turks in and around the Middle East, and then eventually Allenby took over Jerusalem. So anyway, that was kind of the concluding end of the Ottoman Empire. But Islamic Antichrist folks believe that there are prophecies such as the prophecy regarding the Assyrian in Micah and in several other passages which we can talk about, and they believe that the Assyrian is clearly a reference to the Antichrist. They look at antitypes in the Old Testament, such as Antiochus Epiphanes is the way I think it's pronounced, but some people say Epiphanes, which is the way I used to say it, but it's not probably. It's probably Epiphanes. Epiphanes is probably the way it's pronounced, but I'll have to ask one of the theological scholars, what the official wording on that is.
Right.
But anyway, Antiochus the Fourth, he was in Syria. Really, it was in Seleucid. It was the Seleucid Empire of the Greeks. He was actually a Greek in a Hellenistic culture, representing really the Greek thinking, and so he worshipped Greek gods and so forth. So he really was. This was 160 BC. So it was not like he was a Muslim, because Muhammad was still 850 years away.
Right. But
the Seleucid Empire had come about as a result of Alexander the Great, and he had 4 kings, and I always love to say their names: Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus, and Ptolemy.
Nice.
Those are the kings of Alexander, and they split the empire, which Daniel 11 talks about in detail.
Yeah.
They split the empire up into 4 sub-empires, and it gets all into the king of the south, the king of the north, and all that kind of stuff. But long story short is that Antiochus was the best antitype of the Old Testament, and it was he that and his armies that controlled Jerusalem and desecrated the temple during what was known as the War of the Maccabees. And it was from that Hanukkah came out of that war and was celebrated, because the Maccabees eventually defeated the Seleucids, Antiochus's army, and for almost 100 years then, until it wasn't Augustus, it was his prior Pompey, when Pompey finally conquered Jerusalem around 60 BC for the Romans. But for about 100 years. And of course, that kind of set up a number of things that happened in the day of Jesus. But anyway, so the Assyrian is a big element of it. Their interpretation, they stretch some interpretations in Daniel in terms of the kings that are referenced in, or the different empires, the great Colossus of Daniel chapter 2, the great statue, the great Colossus that has a golden head and silver chest and bronze thighs and feet made of clay and iron and made with clay and so forth. So they dismiss the Roman Empire and suggest that the Ottoman Empire is back of Daniel 2, which there's a lot of reasons why I think that's a loony argument, but that is part of the argument of the Islamic Antichrist. And so they reinterpret Mecca as Mystery Babylon. And so these are all kind of core elements of it. And I'm certainly not making it sound like a very compelling argument, but there's quite a lot that does make it a compelling argument, although at the end of the day, I find that it's not that difficult to take it down as an argument, because every element of it has a very soft spot that can be hit.
Well, that makes sense. And you're also working on an entire book just based on that right now, aren't you?
I am. Yeah. I probably will get it finished this weekend. If I wasn't talking to you, I would for sure get it finished this weekend. But I'm talking to you. But it's called Mistaken Identity: The Case Against the Islamic Antichrist, and it's going to be very sharp and very pointed to this question, because Josh, it really turns out that Bill Salus has, as I mentioned, in terms of his point of view regarding Psalm 83, has pretty well captured and conquered almost all of futurism with his idea, which I disagree with. But the Islamic Antichrist has probably captured 50% of futurism based upon the feedback that I see on my Facebook page and my blogs and so forth. There are a lot of people that are convinced. And of course, Joel Richardson had the good fortune of having Joe Farah of WorldNet Daily be his publisher and pour considerable marketing dollars, which good publishers do, pour considerable marketing dollars into getting his book out there. And then there have been some movies, and there's been sequels, and there were prequels, and Joel is a very good man. There's no question about it. He's got a great heart, strongly evangelistic, really dedicated to trying to take the gospel to Islam, to the Muslims, and he's a good thinker and a great writer. So it's not just a question of advertising and money that's caused the Islamic Antichrist to be to have success as a theory. However, and we'll probably get into this more, I think that there's some real serious problems with it and some real serious implications that I think are not true. But again, back to the sort of the original concept, whoever America's enemy is at the time, it's pretty easy to sort of paint them as the Antichrist. And so to some extent, that's an influential factor in the Islamic Antichrist theory.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when you get that, when you finish that book, we'll definitely have to do an entire show on just this question of who the identity of the Antichrist might be, because it's an absolutely fascinating topic, and I know a lot of people have different ideas, and to me they're all. Well, maybe not all of them. I don't. There's a theory that Obama is the Antichrist. I don't think that's very interesting, but because it's
some days we all might say, maybe he's the Antichrist. They go, no way, So and that's probably each of our lives. We have good days and bad days. We'll see. See.
Indeed. So yeah, we'll definitely have to do that. But so what are you brought up Ezekiel 38 earlier, and I've said on this show a lot, Ezekiel is one of my favorite books of the Bible because there's just so much weird stuff in there. I love it. That in itself is like a whole mystery. But specifically Ezekiel 38, 10 through 13. What are the connections between that passage and Psalm 83?
Yeah. Well, what we probably should do is I should take a moment here and open my Bible, which means I'm going to do it online because that's the way I do these things.
Same here.
And I'm going to go find my Bible gateway here. I'm clicking on that. Blue Letter Bible is what I use a lot.
I use those too also. If I'm copying a Bible verse for like copy paste, whatever, or if it's just something I want to read, I use Bible Gateway. And then if I'm doing research, like Especially
great minds think alike.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you have to do too. So that's good. All right, so let's do this. Let me read a little bit here regarding the passage. To get into, I do a very elaborate exposition of these verses, and specifically a particular Hebrew word, betach, which it's about as Hebrew sounding as I can probably get, but it's transliterated and spelled. It would be spelled betach, betach, and it means safety or safely, depending upon its context. It could mean either one, but it also can mean, as we'll see, careless, carelessly, overconfidently, and so it is. It has some very amazing meanings, and that adds to the confusion, essentially. But I think I sort of broke the code and figured out how to decide based on context what we're talking about and who we are talking about when we're talking about or using that word betach. All right, to kind of zero in more on the verses themselves, let me read. I'm going to start reading verse 8 to provide some context, and then I'm going to get into verses 10 through 13 and point out why it is that there seems to be a change of subject, or who we're talking about. It's the whole subject of this chapter is Gog and Magog, who is the prince of Rosh, Meshech, Tubal, Beth Togarmah, Gomer, and others, and brings Persia and all of those countries with him into Israel to attack Israel. And here the Lord is speaking to Israel, and he says, this is verse 8 of chapter 38, "After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have been made always waste. But it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them." And that safely would be betach. All right. So here we're clearly talking about the nation of Israel, its regathering, which, of course, in Ezekiel 37, we have the dry bones. Can a nation live again? Can a nation be born in a day? And so we know that there is a general context for Ezekiel 38, 39 that begins in 37 and so forth. And we know as Ezekiel goes into chapters 40 and beyond, it's dealing likely with the millennium and dealing with the millennial temple and all that. So it's always been understood that Ezekiel 38 and 39 is a last days or messianic passage. So it occurs in the context of when the Messiah comes. All right. So, but here clearly we're dealing with Israel. And it says and he's speaking really to Gog, and he says, "Thou shalt ascend," this is verse 9, "thou shalt ascend and come like a storm. Thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee." So we're dealing with a very large-scale invasion, ground invasion. All right, now in that context, we hit kind of a however in verse 10. "Thus saith the Lord God, it shall also come to pass that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought." All right. And then so there's sort of like, okay, I've been telling you, Gog, you're going to come into Israel. You're going to attack the land. All right, so that's what we've been talking about. In Israel, you're going to be visited. So, all right, verse 8, verse 9, that's what we've covered. Now we come to verse 10, and we see these two intriguing little phrases. "It shall also come to pass," meaning something else different than what I've just told you shall come to pass, "that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought." All right, so now the traditional conventional view, Brother Bill would say this, is that Gog is still thinking about Israel. I would say no. That verse gives us two reasons to say Gog is thinking about something else. That at the same time, it shall also come to pass something different than what I've just told you. All right. Now here's what it says. verse 11, and thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, and that dwell safely. There's the word bachach again. All of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. All right. And of course, that all of these are idioms or phrases used throughout the Old Testament, to talk about whether or not villages or cities are secure or insecure. If they don't have walls, if they don't have bars or gates, either they're foolish and they're careless and they're overconfident, or they have strong reason to feel secure and safe. And it can mean either thing. All right. But what is it that Gog is thinking? And this is where you get to the connection with Psalm 83. In verse 12, it says that you will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages, right? I will go against them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. Why? To take a spoil, verse 12, and to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods that dwell in the midst of the land. All right, now, just taking that verse sort of by itself, it would be easy, as the conventional view and as Bill's view is, to say, well, we're still talking about Israel, because before we talked about how Israel had been gathered out of the nations and had been placed in a desolate land, and it was now inhabited and so forth, and it has grown wealthy, which it has. All right, it's gotten cattle and goods, and it dwells in the midst of the land. The question is, are we still talking about the land of Israel, or are we talking about a different land? Where is the land of unwalled villages? All right, and so I have a whole chapter where I drill down into all of this. And so my heresy, or as John Price, who wrote the foreword to my book, who's written one of the bestsellers called The End of America, John says, no, you've broken this is a real breakthrough. And I have to give Benjamin Baruch some credit for this as well, because this is Benjamin's point of view. And thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. Israel is not a land without bars or gates. Israel has a 417-mile long wall, barbed wire. In some cases, it's as high as 40 feet. But it is built to protect the Israeli population from the Palestinian population. So it clearly is a land of walls, bars, and gates. But what land might we be talking about that isn't a land that doesn't have walls and doesn't have bars and gates? Well, the context, I believe, tells us. Verse 13, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? All right. Now, so the who are we talking about? Sheba and Dedan. Sheba and Dedan were tribes and basically cities eventually in northern and eastern Saudi Arabia. So they typically reference and refer to the Arabs. And of course, Arab itself means mixture. So it is a mixture of desert peoples that we call the Arabs today, but it's associated with Saudi Arabia. And this is not accidental, as I'll point out. And then there's this thing called "and the merchants of Tarshish." Well, now a lot of your listeners will have said, "Well, I've heard that phrase in the Bible before." Yeah, it's actually used a lot. The merchants of Tarshish, and in fact, one of the more interesting stories is the fact that when Jonah was called out by God and told to go preach against Nineveh, that he said, Nineveh, well, that's north. I can get there in 3 days. No, I don't think I want to do that. So instead, he goes, I don't know if it was Joppa or one of the ports, and he basically gets on a ship that will take him to Tarshish. Well, where was Tarshish? Tarshish was as far away from Nineveh as possible. So he's basically saying, I'm going to go to the South Pole. I am not going to go to London or Paris or whatever, right? I'm going to go as far away as I can possibly go. And that's the way that Jonah felt. Well, and at that time, the merchants of Tarshish, it was believed by most scholars that Tarshish was the Tin land, the land of Tin, which was England.
Oh, wow.
And Tarshish was likely the English. In fact, Bill agrees with this. Now, there's a good argument, which we advanced in the Final Babylon, that Tarshish was Tartessos in Spain, which was a province or a city in Spain. And even if that's true, that's still okay, because essentially what you're saying is you're saying far Western European countries. But then it also includes a third entity. It says, with all the young lions thereof. Well, young lions, scripturally, of course, there are Old Testament references to lions and so forth, but it has been a kind of a common understanding for several hundred years now that when we talk about lions, we're talking about England. And if we talk about its lion cubs or its young lions, which is what's referenced here, most people conclude we're talking about the colonies of England, the colonies of Tarshish. And so what's intriguing then, Josh, about these three things, which I point out, is what do you have if you connect Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, and the United States together? What do you have? You have the petrodollar.
Oh, wow.
All right. And so you have the monetary system of the world right now, essentially in these three nations. And what does the verse say? It says, "Art thou," that these three nations are saying? They're saying, "Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil?" Now, the conventional view has always said, well, these three nations are essentially nations that are sitting out. They are protesting what's happened between Gog and Israel. That's the point of view. And that Sheba and Dedan, there, and the merchants of Tarshish, the United States, that they really don't want to get involved, that they are reluctant to get involved to help Israel. And so we can kind of see why, well, all those things, that all kind of makes sense, And so maybe we're still talking about Israel. Maybe we're still talking about the fact that Gog has come to take a spoil in Israel. And that really is the basis for the Psalm 83 war. The Psalm 83 war isn't in Psalm 83. It's in this passage. It's in verses 10, 11, and 12 of Ezekiel 38. And it's in the supposition that Sheba and Dedan and merchants of Tarshish, young lions, are just protesting the attack of Gog upon Israel. What I have posited is that, which I think is even more plausible, is they're not astonished because of Gog's attack upon Israel. They are astonished because of Gog's attack upon them.
Oh, wow.
And what I posited is that prior to Gog, which I believe is Russia, which is conventional, and Bill agrees with that, by the way. Prior to Gog coming to attack Israel, it attacks preemptively and first strikes the United States, to a lesser extent the UK, and perhaps not with nuclear forces, but with conventional forces, it attacks Saudi Arabia. And the reason that kind of makes some sense is because Gog is aligned with Persia, perhaps with Turkey. It certainly seems that way, although right now Russia and Turkey are not exactly best friends. But all of these other nations outside of this inner circle of Israel come against Israel. And yet, what would happen if we look at it geopolitically and we said, all right, so do we really think that the United States and the United Kingdom and even Saudi Arabia would sit by if Gog moves against Israel, but probably also Jordan, potentially Iraq? If all of this is clearly a play for the Shiites and the Russians to come against Saudi Arabia, what would be the response of the United States, England, and Saudi Arabia? Probably would be to decide, well, they're probably coming ultimately for economic reasons to basically wipe out the petrodollar and to instate some other form of currency that's been put in place by the BRICS nation, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the spoil, the cattle and goods that they're really getting, which is much more spoil than Israel could ever gather by attacking essentially poor nations around them, with the exception of the oil fields and the oil pipelines in Syria, that they're essentially coming to destroy the economic system of the world, and the fact that the BRICS nations essentially owe almost $2 trillion to England, America, and indirectly Saudi Arabia. So you have very strong economic reasons, and you have some real cattle and goods, real silver and gold, and real spoil. And so that's why I think that it is actually a more logical, geopolitical, and I argue scripturally correct argument to see the subject matter of verses 11, 12, 13 is really relating not to Israel, but relating to the United States, secondarily the UK, and in third place, Saudi Arabia. So in a nutshell, that's what I'm suggesting, which of course rattles the cages of all of the conventional theorists, except for the few that have studied this, and John Price certainly would agree. And the other person that really helped me here was an author named Douglas Berner, Berner, who wrote a book called The Silence is Broken, about the wars of Gog and Magog, and did a fabulous job compiling all the different views on the war of Gog and Magog. And essentially, he and I are aligned just about 100% in terms of the implications. So we'll get to some of those as we talk more.
Wow, that is really cool. See, that's what I love about this kind of stuff, because when you actually go through and break down those verses in Ezekiel, that interpretation really makes a lot of sense. And that's one thing that I found with the book of Ezekiel, possibly for me personally, possibly more than any other book in the Bible, is the more I read it, and I think I got a good handle on it, and then something else comes along, and it's like, well, that makes even more sense. And like I said earlier, that
is.
Yeah,
it's one of the meatiest books in the Bible. I don't know if it's because Ezekiel had so much time to think when he was laying on his side. I know he's told by God to lay on his side and prophesy against Israel, and then later prophesy against Judah. But it's a very meaty book, and there's, of course, I've just really touched the top level, going specifically into this issue of the word safely and safety. There's some real hidden and powerful elements of that very word and its usage in the context, how it's translated here. And let me just give you a flavor for that. So the word again, which we see as safety or safely, either as an adjective or an adverb, it again depends upon the context, but it can also mean carelessly. And what's really interesting is that the word is used, I believe it's 36 times translated. The word betak appears and is translated by the King James Bible 36 times. 30 of those times it references a genuineness about dwelling safely or dwelling in safety. 6 of those times it references dwelling carelessly, overconfidently, feeling that you're protected when you're not, being arrogant. So 30 of the 36 times it's dealing with the genuine dwelling safely, and 6 times dealing carelessly and overconfidently. All right, now the issue that conventional people have said is, well, okay, we know that it can be translated that way. In verse 11, when it says, and thou shalt say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages, I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. Now, it can mean dwelling carelessly. The question is, why did the King James translators here say that dwell safely versus dwelling arrogantly? Well, it is, possible that they got it right, that they are dwelling safely, but it's not dealing with Israel. It's because Israel is a land of walls and bars and gates, but the United States could be dwelling safely. But actually, in the Old Testament, every time that the term is used, these 6 other times, what I discovered is that it never references Israel.
Oh, wow.
It always references the enemies of Israel. So in this context, if this was referencing Israel, it would be the only instance in the Bible where Israel, in the Messianic time frame, is dwelling carelessly, which means that it's not likely that that's what the interpretation is. But interestingly, in Isaiah, I believe it's Isaiah 47. I apologize, I don't have all these verses right at my fingertips, but the most probably the most dramatic case where it talks about dwelling carelessly, dwelling overconfidently, relates to the daughter of Babylon, that dwells carelessly, overconfidently, that says, I am a queen when you are not, and so forth. And it's in that context that we have to ask, well, who is the daughter of Babylon?
Right.
The daughter of Babylon, I believe, is the United States. And those that have studied it, and there are more and more books coming out all the time, tend to agree that the daughter of Babylon is not a future physical reconstruction of Babylon on the Euphrates, but it is sort of a connected with Mystery Babylon of Revelation 16, 17, 18, so forth. And so if you look at it from that standpoint, then all of a sudden you find, again, all these examples. There are examples of the Danites that are dealing with a situation in Joshua, the book of Joshua, dwelling safely, dwelling carelessly. The king of Tyre, the Tarshish, every example are nations other than Israel, and typically nations that are in opposition to God. So I think that's not coincidental. I think that's indicative of the fact that that here we are rightly translating it. They dwell safely. That's a land of unwalled villages, and therefore it's not Israel. And when you add to it the context of Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and the young lions, then I think that colors that whole passage, and it says we're not dealing with Israel. We have a parenthetical comment. We're dealing with these other nations that really control the economic power of the world in the last days, which is Wall Street. It's the city of London, which is this little separate city in the heart of London that is, in effect, their Wall Street. And it's Saudi Arabia that really has supported the petrodollar, oil being, in fact, the commodity behind the dollar rather than gold, ever since Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1970, 71, I guess it was. So if we look at some other verses in this context, there's some really intriguing things that we learn that talks about the fact that what's happening in Israel is not just in Israel, that it is actually global in scope. For instance, going down through verse 21 through 23 in chapter 38, it says, and I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord God, against every man's sword shall be against his brother. So this is referring to Gog and all of the hordes of Gog, all of the combined armies. Verse 22, and I will plead against him with pestilence and with blood, and I will rain upon him and upon his bands and upon the people that are with him an overflowing rain and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. And I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord. All right, so the issue here is that this is across the whole Middle East in this context. And and then let's see. Let me jump back up to verse 20. We find out, though, by reading verse 20, that it's not just the context of the Middle East and those nations that have come against Israel, which of course could include Russia, but it's actually the whole world is involved. In verse 20, so that the fishes of the sea and the fowls of the heaven and the beasts of the field and all creeping things that creep upon the earth and all the men that are upon the face of the earth shall shake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. Sounds like some of the passages from Revelation, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
A global earthquake. And in Revelation, of course, there are two global earthquakes. One in Revelation 6, I believe the other is in Revelation 17, but I'd have to go back and take a look. But it looks like that there is a massive earthquake. And of course, in the book, you may not have gotten to this yet, but in the last chapter of the book, I get into this issue of the global earthquake and what that tells us in terms of the synchronizing of the Gog and Magog war with the events in Revelation, and I also conjecture when the rapture might be as a result of the sequencing of the chronologies of all of these things. So a whole lot there. But let me go on further to Ezekiel 39. What we find, and Bill actually agrees with this, is that once again the context is not just the nations that come against Israel. But again, just starting verse 39, therefore thou shalt, thou son of man, prophesy against Gog, and say, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, which also could be translated the prince of Rosh, Meshach and Tubal. Big controversy over whether chief is translated chief, as in like high priest, chief priest, or chief prince, or whether it should be translated the prince of Rosh, Russia, Meshach and Tubal. And translations have gone all the way back, even before the time of Christ, to the Septuagint talks about Rosh as a nation, believe it or not. And that, of course, was 200 to 400 years before Christ. It says in verse 2, and I will turn thee back and leave but the sixth part of thee, and will cause thee to come up from the north parts, and will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. And I will smite thy bow out of thy left hand, and will cause thine arrows to fall to thy right hand. Thou shalt fall upon the mountains of Israel, thou and all thy bands, and the people that is with thee. I will give thee unto the ravenous birds of every sort, to the beasts of the field to be devoured. Again, a lot of parallels with Revelation. Thou shalt fall upon the open field, for I have spoken it, saith the Lord. Now, here's what's interesting. Verse 6, and I will send a fire on Magog, which is the land of Gog. And that is a reference to the lands between and above the Black and the Caspian Sea, or Russia, and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles. And they shall know that I am the Lord. Now, even Hal Lindsey, but Bill Silas as well, believed that this concept of sending fire upon Magog and those that dwell carelessly in the isles is a reference to the faraway nations around the world. That reference is actually used even all the way back in Genesis 10, talking about the table of nations. And the little term isles, which is translated isles, is actually pronounced E. It's like an EY. It's pronounced E. And it references islands or continents or land masses far from the center of the earth, which the center of the earth, of course, biblically is Jerusalem.
Wow.
And so it suggests here that God is sending judgment upon all of the earth, not just Gog and the land of Magog. And so we're going to say, so I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them pollute my holy name anymore, and the heathen shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. All right, and then it goes forth and talks about how this gets into the details of how long it will take to bury the dead. It will take 7 months to bury the dead, but it will take 7 years to thoroughly cleanse the land. And so this gets into some really intriguing timing, which again I get into in the last chapter of the book, talking about what this tells us about the sequence of the War of Gog and Magog, the War of Armageddon, when this might occur. And I do, thanks to the work of Douglas Brenner, I do an analysis of all of the different scholars over the last, let's say, 100 years, and where they believe during this 7-year tribulation period or before, when they believe Magog and Magog occurs. And I will just tell you the position I come to is that it occurs about 3.5 years before the beginning of Daniel's 70th week.
Oh, wow.
All right. So, and I'm not alone. There's actually a number of scholars. Douglas Brenner takes the same position, that we're dealing with the Gog and Magog war about 10 to 10.5 years before the physical, visible return of Christ. All right. And so this ties in Arnold Fruchtenbaum. I quote him talking about the sequence because of the fact that Ezekiel points these curious facts out about 7 years and 7 months to bury the dead and so forth. And so we're getting a picture of a longer period of time than just the Battle of Gog and Magog. But the supposition I have is before Gog could come against the land of Israel, he would first have to neutralize the merchants of Tarshish and the young lions. And oh, by the way, to make the Shia happy, he will also take away Mecca from the Sunnis and give it to the Shia, which,
Wow.
of course, settle the Shiite-Sunni discussion. So that's all part of, in my view, the Gog-Magog discussion. Now, Bill Silas definitely disagrees with me on this. But again, what I'm saying is that the only reason Bill is predicting that Psalm 83, the Psalm 83 war, is a war for Israel to capture booty and spoil, is so that it will make Gog envious, and Gog will want to come against Israel and capture its booty and spoil. And I'm saying geopolitically, economically, that makes absolutely no sense. It doesn't matter whether or not Israel's discovered oil in the Golan Heights, whether or not they've discovered one of the largest natural gas reserves just off the coast of what was Caesarea Philippi up in that northern Israel. That doesn't matter. None of that compares to the economic bonus one gets if one destroys the banking system of the world and cancels all the debts that you owe, which is essentially where Russia is.
Wow.
And the Chinese, by the way. All right. And all the third world. I mean, you talk about a banking holiday that everyone would jump up and down. If the daughter of Babylon was destroyed, the merchants of the world might be upset to see it's burning in one day. But everyone that owes the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the whole the International Bank of Settlements, this is the whole monetary system of the world. Basically what happens is if Russia, in fact, as we propose, and I'm not alone, this is where Benjamin Baruch, J.R. Nyquist, who's an expert in Russian geopolitics and Russian military strategy. And the book we did called, which is basically their book, I wrote the foreword to it and participated in that's editing and so forth. It's called The New Tactics of Global War. And that book is a book that really deals with the probability of a Russian first strike against the United States. So all this kind of gets wrapped together. And I'm basically saying I anticipate that Russia is going to mount a first strike against the United States. And that's why the first 100 pages of the book, The Next Great War in the Middle East, is dealing with all of the geopolitical issues leading up to a conflict with Russia and the United States that is resolved in part by Russia attacking the United States, basically knocking it out of commission, not perhaps 100%, but enough so that the United States is not in a position to defend Israel. It's not just that the United States is mad at Israel and won't defend it. It's that the United States has been basically taken out of the game such that it cannot respond to the situation in Israel. And thus, only God can protect Israel. And that seems to be what the scripture plainly says, that no one will come to the aid of Israel, not the United States, not the UK, certainly not Europe, certainly not the other Arab nations. No one comes to the aid of Israel except the God of the Bible, except Jehovah. And what the scripture also is telling us here is that while and this clearly is spelled out in Jeremiah 50 and 51. The daughter of Babylon, it talks about several times, will be destroyed by nations from the north, not one nation, but many nations from the north. They will come against the land of, the land of unwalled villages. They will come against the daughter of Babylon, the land that's also called the land of the Chaldeans. But again, this is speaking allegorically or figuratively in that context. And it says that it will be destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah, which is with fire and brimstone, not like, Babylon was never destroyed like that. Babylon just sort of was destroyed brick by brick, literally people stealing the bricks from Babylon, and it just kind of went to nothing, except for a few little ziggurats that still stick out of the ground. But the Babylon of the daughter of Babylon of Jeremiah 50, 51, Isaiah 13 and 14, Psalm 137, Zechariah, Obadiah, there's references to the daughter of Babylon, and they all together speak to this, that the United States, in my view, is going to be destroyed, and I think the scripture teaches that. And if, of course, you've read the other books that I've written about the final Babylon and all that, so you know that there's dozens and dozens and dozens of reasons why I argue that. And but ultimately, that's what I see happening, and that occurs long before the tribulation actually begins. It is a tumultuous event, but it's not part of the great tribulation. And even this great earthquake that's talked about in Ezekiel 38, which may also be referenced in Revelation 6, that is connected with the day of the Lord. It's one of the reasons I think Peter Goodgame and others have said the day of the Lord is about a 10-year period, and it begins with the battle of Gog and Magog, and it concludes with the physical return of Christ and the campaign of Armageddon, in which the Messiah comes back. He essentially rounds up all the troops that have been protected in Edom, in Basra, the Basra that's in not the Sinai, but the desert to the east and north of Sinai, Gulf of Aqaba, in that area, the city of Petra, Mount Seir, all of that. That's the area that is somehow supernaturally protected, and where Israel flees when the Antichrist reveals himself 3.5 years before Jesus physically returns. So anyway, all of these things are all kind of taken together and plotted on a chronology, and that's kind of where I come from. So but we see in Ezekiel 39 that the Lord is using these events to bring glory to his name and to tell the whole world that he is the God of Israel. And so he himself has brought judgment against Russia and those nations that confederated with Russia, that destroyed America. He brings judgment against them. So all of a sudden, after the war of Gog and Magog, you have eliminated the two most prominent powers in the world. You've eliminated the United States, really the Anglo-American axis. You've eliminated Russia. And now there's a guy named Antichrist that comes into the picture to pick up all the pieces. And over about a 3.5 year period of time, he assembles what's left and then begins the reconstruction of the temple and all of the sequences of events in the conventional view that happen in the Daniel's 70th week. And so that's the connection that I and actually a lot of others, Grant Jeffrey, saw this happening before in fact, I'll turn to all of the scholars that because this may sound like, oh, wow, nobody says that. Actually, many of those that have studied Gog and Magog, this is exactly what they say, that it is a series of years before the tribulation and Daniel's 70th week begins. And so let's see, here it is. All right, so those that believe that it happens at the very beginning of the 70th week, J.R. Church, Peter Goodgame, Thomas McCall, Charles R. Taylor, Zola Levitt. But those that believe it happens sometime before the 70th week, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, Emil Gaverluck, John Hagee, Grant Jeffrey, Tim LaHaye, Chuck Missler, Randall Price, Chuck Smith, Douglas Berner, Douglas Woodward. So there's a lot of us that argue that the Gog-Magog war happens prior to the 70th week, the final 7 years, and based upon these really strange references in Ezekiel to taking 7 years to cleanse the land and 7 months to bury the dead and so on, and the fact that the Jews escape and flee from the Antichrist 3.5 years before the end, it actually provides a pretty tight chronology of what's happening in that last 10.5 years, which I believe is the day of the Lord.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and that's something that years ago I researched for my first book, Disclosure, on what Ezekiel 38 and 39 was all about, and I came to a similar conclusion that that this war would happen sometime before the tribulation, and so that's pretty cool. Going back to,
I'll put your name in that box too, then.
Yeah, going back to Psalm 83, I have a two-part question. You talk about in the book that of Psalm 83 is an ongoing war.
Right.
Why do you believe that? And also, what is the conventional view of Psalm 83, and why do you disagree?
Okay. Conventional view of Psalm 83 is that it's just an imprecatory psalm. It has no prophetic implication. Tommy Ice holds that view. But so the conventional view is that it's not a prophetic psalm. Mm-hmm. The updated view that Bill Salas has argued, and for instance, David Reagan, Lion and Lamb Ministries, buys into it. Quite a few others do, as I said. And in fact, most prophecy teachers today agree with Bill. Not all. But most agree with Bill. And the issue, and why I say it is prophetic, is that, and Arnold Fruchtenbaum, he takes this position as well. He says it is prophetic in the sense that it's saying that Israel will always be faced with adversaries on its borders. And these adversaries may in fact be ancestors of these tribes that lived 3,000 years ago. Or they might not be. They might just be those tribal names were pinpointing locations surrounding Israel where they were. But the main point of that is that Israel is completely surrounded by enemies on all sides. All right. So I go further and closer to Bill's view. And I say I think it is legitimate to say that Psalm 83 is predicting that Israel will always be at war with its neighbors, and therefore all of the wars of the 20th century and 21st century are in fact implied or embedded within the Psalm 83 prophecy. All right, so I think it is prophetic. Now, where I disagree with Bill is that Bill essentially says all of the wars that have happened to this point don't count. And the burden of Damascus, we've seen Damascus almost, not totally, but almost totally destroyed in the last couple of years since the Arab Spring in 2011. Most people that are real strict constructionists, I might call them, would say that Isaiah 17, the burden of Damascus, has not yet happened. I would say, no, it is in the process of happening. Damascus is being destroyed. I talk about the term Yom, Y-O-M, which is that's the transliteration for the Hebrew day. But reason I point that out is that day can mean so many things. Right. There are some that say, day just means 24 hours. Our friend Doug Hamp, that's one of the things he wants to argue. The day of the Lord, it's just a 24-hour day. That's all that Yom means. No, Yom can mean all kinds of things. can mean the day of Abraham, meaning the time of his life. It can mean a day can mean a year. A day can mean a year less a day. A day can mean a season. A day can mean a period of time that's not fully bounded. The scripture uses yom in all of those ways. And so day can mean a whole lot of different things. So the day of the Lord can mean specifically a period of time that begins and that ends, but it is not obvious from just using the term day how long that period of time is. All right, and so that is kind of the issue. How did I get into that? We were talking about Psalm 83 and the fact that so Bill is arguing that Psalm 83 must happen prior to Ezekiel 38 and 39. So he says it must happen before. And why does he say that? He says because Israel must have spoil that Gog wants to capture, and Israel must be the land of unwalled villages. So Israel must be dwelling securely. So it's a logical argument that says that Israel takes over all of its surrounding natures so that it gathers spoil and booty, and it takes over all those nations so it no longer feels insecure. So he's arguing that right out of Ezekiel 38, that passage, those passages 10 through 13. That information is not in Psalm 83. It is in Ezekiel 38. It is implied if you take that passage as referencing Israel. But as I argued, if you see that context of that passage is, but also at the same time, an evil thought shall come into your mind. Essentially, another evil thought shall come into your mind. So that's why we have a disagreement then on, that Psalm 83 he believes is a predecessor. I would say, well, it is to a point, but to some extent, Psalm 83 is just a prophecy of the fact that Israel will always be surrounded by its enemies until Messiah comes and destroys all of its enemies and truly brings the kingdom and the peace that is talked about when Betach is usually used as safety and security. That is the safety and security of the messianic reign of Christ.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And going back to the issue of who Gog is, you and I agree with this, and I know a lot of people do. Is that Russia is Gog? That's something that I've come across in my own research and have been pretty much thoroughly convinced of that. Yet there are some that might say Russia isn't powerful enough to fulfill that. How would you respond to that? And also, what has changed in Russia's weapon systems and strategy that makes them a power in the Middle East and a threat to Israel?
Right. Well, this is such a big issue. It's why I've had to write 2 books on it.
Right.
But the folks that believe in the Islamic Antichrist, they believe that Turkey is the power base of the Antichrist. The Antichrist will be a Muslim. He will be, in fact, Walid Shubat. I don't know if Joel Richardson is this specific, but Shubat is emphatic that the current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, is the Antichrist. All right, and that Saudi Arabia is Mecca. It's Mystery Babylon. That's what we're talking about. The conventional view, really going all the way back to a Hebrew scholar